This time I'd like to call on our former governor and U.S. Senator from Florida, Bob Graham. Senator?
I appreciate that kind introduction, and I also want to recognize Dan Christensen, who I've known for a long time and feel as if we've almost become bonded over the past year on some topics that I'll comment upon. And thank each one of you for being here this evening. I see a lot of faces that bring back memories, most of them very happy and upbeat memories. One I want to mention, which was a somewhat down memory, is my good friend Jack Norris. Jack Norris was for many years in the Attorney General's office here in Fort Lauderdale. Prior to that time, he had worked in my state Senate office. And on a day in March of 1977, we launched our campaign for governor. We were in Tallahassee for the legislative session. We took a long ride, Jack and I, out to Pensacola, did a radio show, had a meeting with a teachers organization, then headed back to Tallahassee, where we stopped in Fort Walton Beach to have supper. And we were going to have supper at a Howard Johnson. Now, Howard Johnson really sort of marks how old you are if you remember that. But its restaurants didn't have a particularly great reputation for food, but our choices were limited, so there's where we went. And we ended up actually having a very good supper. And as we finished, I walked out on the sidewalk, waiting for Jack to pay the bill, of course. And I was writing down the address of this Howard Johnson when a young man came out and he introduced himself. He said, "My name is Randy Watts. What are you doing here?" And I said, "Well, I'm writing down the address of this restaurant because I want to write a letter to the manager." Randy's face blanks. He says, "You didn't like your food?" And I said, "No, quite to the contrary. My friend and I had a very good supper, and we want to let the manager know." To which Randy said, "I'm the cook. Would you mention me personally?" And I said, "Sure, Randy," and I wrote his name down. By this time, Jack had come, and Jack saw the two of us talking, and he said, "Randy, I want to introduce you to Bob Graham. Bob Graham is running for governor." Well, Randy proceeded to look at me, and he started at the tip of the toes of my shoes, and he gradually moved up to the top of my head, and then he turned to Jack and said, "He's running for governor?" "Governor of what?" Well, that's a very encouraging way to start your campaign. I'm going to talk this evening at some brevity. My wife has already forewarned me to leave time for questions about some other events. Of course, today we're celebrating the 11th anniversary of one of the most horrific events in the history of the country. I don't think the word celebrate, but recognize, and the recognition that we gave a few moments ago to the victims is very appropriate. I want to talk about where I was that day and how I happened to get there. I was chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee. The chairman of the House Committee was a friend and former and fellow Floridian named Porter Goss from Sanibel. Porter and I, in the early summer, went to the CIA and we said, we think it's clear that the issue of terrorism is going to be a more significant one for U.S. intelligence agencies. We would like your suggestions as to where we could go during the August recess to learn more about this. And they gave us several places to visit. The final and most significant of those was Pakistan. While we were in Pakistan, our host was the head of the Pakistani equivalent of the CIA, which is called the ISI, a man by the name of General Ahmed. And he treated us very generously. We visited a number of important places for the war on terrorism that was just beginning in Pakistan. At the end of the week, he had an elaborate dinner in the lawn in front of the main building of ISI. Porter and I and Adele, I'd like to introduce my beautiful bride, who was also with us. We extended an invitation to General Ahmed to give us the opportunity to reciprocate when he came to Washington. He accepted, and it was only a few days later when we got a message through the Pakistani embassy that General Ahmed was going to be in Washington. And so we arranged a breakfast which took place in the conference room of the House Intelligence Committee, which is on the 4th floor of the Capitol. We were anxious to talk to General Ahmed. One of the things we were particularly interested in was his assessment of the Taliban in Afghanistan. The Pakistanis, since the beginning of nationhood, have looked at the map and have seen that their hostile neighbor, India, has a land mass of about 3 times Pakistan's and has a population at that time of about 5 times Pakistan. This they interpreted as meaning that Pakistan was very vulnerable to a land assault by a much larger Indian army. Their response to that was a doctrine of not trying to defend Pakistan, but rather moving to the west over the large mountains that separated Pakistan from Afghanistan, and then make their stand on the other side of those mountains in Afghanistan. Well, this necessitated that Pakistan have good relations with Afghanistan, because they didn't want to be seen by the Afghanis as an invading force when what they were really doing was a staged retreat. And the person who had the responsibility of maintaining that relationship traditionally had been the head of the ISI. And so that responsibility had now devolved on General Ahmed. So we asked General Ahmed, from his intimate knowledge of the Taliban, to talk to us about what kind of people they were, what were their values, what was their mentality, what was their motivation. And he started an explanation by saying that most people live in 3 phases of life. We have some memories of what's happened in the past. We have some dreams and aspirations about what may happen in the future, but we spend most of our time focused on today. He said that is not true with the Taliban. They do not believe either the past or the present is of any value. The only phase of life which is worth pursuing is after death. And therefore, the constraints, the cultural standards, the sanctions by a rule of law that affect the way people behave when they are concerned about the here and now are irrelevant to the Taliban. At that point, a young staff member came in the room and gave Porter a note, and it was dated September the 11th, 2001, and told Porter that the first tower of the World Trade Center had been hit by an airplane. We were surprised about that, but not distraught. There had been a long history of airplanes running into small buildings. The Empire State Building has been hit some 3 or 4 times. So we moved on, and he continued his discussion of the Taliban until that same young staff man came in and said, a Boeing 757 has just hit the second World Trade Center. Well, immediately we knew it was not a fortuitous series of events. Our breakfast broke up and we all scattered. It was the first time in decades that the capital of the United States of America was involuntarily vacated. It had not been vacated during World War I or World War II or any other crisis situations, but it was on September the 11th, 2001. And I quickly found myself standing on the east lawn of the Capitol, surrounded by a large group of colleagues. One of those colleagues pointed out that, and by this time the Pentagon had been hit, that 3 planes had hit major symbols of American strength, but there was no symbol greater than that building immediately in front of us. And that and there were rumors about multiple planes being in the air, and that it was likely that one of those had that building as its target. So we scattered from the lawn. Fortunately, because of the bravery of the passengers who were able to bring down the 4th plane over Shankstown, Pennsylvania, rather than have it reach its target, the Capitol or the White House was spared. Out of that shared experience, Porter and I began talking about the fact that there needed to be a comprehensive congressional inquiry into what had happened up to 9/11 and how well government had responded during and after 9/11. And so we got the permission of our leadership and then our colleagues to establish a joint inquiry on 9/11. One of the first things that struck me as we began our hearings was the implausibility that those 19 people could have done what they did alone. Those 19 people, few of them spoke English, even fewer of them had ever been in the United States, and yet they were able to develop, practice, and execute an extremely complicated plan. It would be like if the 19 people in the first couple of rows here tonight were to be told, you're going to have an assignment important to America. You are going to be infiltrated in a foreign country. You are going to be asked, you're going to be given the outlines of a mission, but you'll be responsible for filling in the details and then carrying out that mission. And throughout the period that you're in this foreign country, you have to maintain absolute anonymity. Now, 19 good Americans, the country that you're going to be infiltrated in is Yemen. How well do you think you could carry out the assignment that I've just outlined? I think you would agree it would be quite difficult. Well, that was exactly the situation with the 19 hijackers. It became my belief, and I suggest the belief of a majority of the members of our joint inquiry, that there had to be some external support system that made it possible for those 19 hijackers to be able to do what they actually did. That was a theory up until midsummer of 2002, when we stumbled on the fact that in San Diego, 2 of the hijackers had lived in one case for a year, the other case for about 7 months. Anonymously, they had taken flight lessons, they had been well-financed, and they had been surrounded by a group of elder Saudis. Both of these men were themselves Saudi nationals. We found that to be very suspicious. And then we found that the man who had been the principal support had a ghost job, which meant that he got paid both a salary and for expenses, but never was expected to show up to work. And in the days that when the two hijackers moved to San Diego, his non-salary income increased by 8 times, raising the suspicion that he had become the conduit to funnel the money that necessary to support these people. He also, with his family, left San Diego just 6 weeks before 9/11, again raising the question of had he been tipped off that something was going to happen and that it might be better if he were not in San Diego. That was our principal piece of evidence. We wrote that in our final report. Our report of over 800 pages was submitted to a clearance committee. They took 7 months to review it. It was heavily redacted. That means black lines drawn through names of people, places, events. But there was one chapter of 28 pages which had as its title the role of foreign entities in the financing of 9/11 hijackers, that was totally censored, including much of the information that I've just talked about in San Diego. That chapter continues to be unavailable to the American people today, almost a decade after it was first released. I was concerned about that to the point that in 2004, I wrote a book called Intelligence Matters, which is the history of 9/11 and the run-up to the Iraq War as seen through my perspective as chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee. We asked the FBI to look at other places where the hijackers had lived for a significant period of time to see if there was any pattern similar to San Diego. The place where more hijackers lived for more days in the United States was Delray Beach, Florida. The FBI was reluctant to engage in any of these requests for review. The only place we know where they did accept the challenge was in Sarasota. Why Sarasota? Sarasota was the place where 3 of the 4 pilots did their pilot training, including the most prominent of the 19 hijackers, Atta, who was the pilot of the first plane that hit the World Trade Center. My good friend Dan and another associate of his named Tony Summers began to investigate what might have happened in Sarasota. And in the course of the investigation, they talked to a number of, I'm not going to describe them, but local people of some authority who told the story that these 3 hijackers had spent a considerable amount of time at a upscale subdivision called Prestancia in the home of a 3-generation Saudi family who lived there. That family, 10 days before 9/11, under what was described as being hurried circumstances, had left Sarasota and went back to Saudi Arabia. Dan and Tony worked assiduously to try to get the documentation to be able to learn more about the investigation, how fulsome it was, what did it find out, and what did the FBI do with the information that they had. And thus far, they've been stonewalled, and thus the recent request for Freedom of Information Act release of this information. I think it's very important that this information about Sarasota, Delray Beach, and other places where the hijackers would have benefited by a support network be made available, and for two basic reasons. One is security. If there was, in fact, such a network, what leads us to believe that that network has evaporated, been dismissed, or rolled up? I have no reason to believe that that's occurred, and therefore a conservative perspective would be to assume that it was still in place and available for future terrorists to use in future attacks against the United States. So it's a matter of security today, but it also is a matter of justice. There are 6,000 Americans who are either survivors of the attack, and one of those ladies is in our audience, and I'm sorry I can't spot her, or they are members of the family of victims. They have, for the last several years, been attempting to get justice through litigation against Saudi Arabia for its complicity in 9/11. Thus far, they've been frustrated, sadly to say, frustrated with the support of the United States government, which has said that the principle of sovereign immunity applies, and you can't sue a foreign government, even when the allegations are that they murdered in the United States hundreds, thousands of Americans. So those are the reasons why I think that now's the time to reopen this investigation. I believe that it would serve the cause of security and justice, and it would bring closure to this issue. I also think the president ought to use his authority to declassify documents, to remove the censorship label on those 28 pages, and other documents, such as the ones that Dan is now seeking, so that the American people could read for themselves what had transpired. And I think, third, that doctrine of sovereign immunity should be amended when the allegation is that a foreign government participated in the murder of Americans within the United States of America. That's what the article that appeared today in the Huffington Post asked for. I am hopeful, guardedly optimistic, but not naively optimistic, that this might happen. Eventually, this information is going to come out. We have a standard that classified information after 20 years, unless there is a specific presidential directive to the contrary, does get released to the public. So in another decade or so, a lot of this information that is currently being withheld is going to automatically become available unless the then president decides to do what President Bush and President Obama have elected to do, which is to withhold this information. I hope we don't have to wait a decade for security or for justice. Thank you.
Good. Thank you. My first question was about the Huffington Post article and what the chances are. So you think there is a chance that this can happen? Maybe you can elaborate as to why, and also what members of the audience might do if they agree with you.
Well, I guess I'm just a bubbling optimist who thinks that people are inclined to do the right thing. But I said I'm not a naive optimist, and it's possible that we will have to wait another decade to learn more about what transpired. What can these good people do? Write a letter to President Obama and say that you as a citizen of this country, you as a citizen who lives in a community that was close to the epicenter of hijacker activity while they were living in the United States, are very concerned that information about the possibility of a support system that made it possible for the hijackers to live in Delray Beach for such a long period of time and to do the things that they did, including learn how to fly big airplanes, and that there should be a reopening of the investigation in order to get to the bottom of those unanswered questions. Thank you, Mr. President. I would appreciate the courtesy of your reply.
Right.
How about that?
Let me, if I might, let me ask you about the FBI here, because we've talked about this a number of times here. And, you know, they said that they found nothing regarding this incident in Sarasota. There was nothing sinister. But they won't discuss it. They won't tell us why they think that. And that's what's led us to do our thing. But they also said something that is verifiable, and that is that they disclosed this incident to Congress and to the 9/11 Commission. Is that correct or not?
No, it's not. The FBI, issued two statements immediately after Dan's work became public, and it said basically three things. First, there was a full investigation of the alleged relationship between hijackers and Saudis living in Sarasota. Number two, that the result of that investigation was to find there was no such relationship. And three, that the information on that investigation had been made fully available to the two committees of inquiry, the Joint Congressional Committee and the Citizens 9/11 Committee. Well, I knew that I had never seen that, and I was co-chair of the Joint Congressional Inquiry. I called my friend Porter Goss, and I said, Porter, you used to represent Sarasota when you were in the Congress. Did you know that this was going on in Sarasota? And his answer was no. I then checked with our very able executive director and asked her if she had seen any such information, and she said no. I then repeated that with Lee Hamilton, Tom Kane, and Philip Zellicoe, the three key people in the 9/11 Commission. They had exactly the same answer. With that, I thought there was enough smoke to try to find out if the first two statements had verification. And the answer is, based on some personal investigation, some work that Dan did, and surprisingly, I was given access to some FBI files which were directly contrary to the public statements in terms of the fulsomeness of the investigation and the conclusion.
And then I'll shut up. Why? Why would the FBI, why wouldn't they like to get to the bottom of this like everybody else?
Well, that's a very important and difficult question. Now, I'm now going to go commercial for a bit. I mentioned the book Intelligence Matters, which I say is the book that asks the questions, such as the ones that we've been talking about. If you want to know the answer, you have to go to fiction, and that's Keys to the Kingdom. You will
Why
see,
fiction? Why fiction?
well, and the reason for it is because I had tried, both in the report of the joint inquiry and in the book Intelligence Matters, to talk about some of these items, and in both instances they were censored out of the book. And so I was frustrated, and a friend of mine told me about his own frustrations in a similar situation, and that the way he'd responded to it was to write what he was going to say as nonfiction as fiction. and that got around the censorship standards. And I'll say that more than 40% of Keys to the Kingdom is truth, with the exception that in the case of living people, I changed their names. But the events, the locales, the context are historically accurate.
Senator, you alluded to the possibility that there has been a cover-up by both the Bush administration and the Obama administration, that they have done absolutely nothing to pursue this thing. The possibility that Saudi nationals were very, very much involved, and are still very much possibly involved in terrorist activities against the United States. Why do you think that both administrations have covered this up?
Well, it's easier to answer for the Bush administration. The Bush administration had a very close relationship with the House of Saud, which had gone back 3 generations. George W. Bush's father and grandfather, Prescott Bush, had close both personal and business relations with Saudi Arabia. You might also say it was oil that we've depended upon Saudi Arabia as a significant supplier, and that we didn't want to put that in jeopardy. Another was that we, in the post 9/11 era, we needed Saudi Arabia for its intelligence capability and maybe its capacity, should it elect to use it, to restrain some of these terrorist groups. I don't know which is right. Keys to the Kingdom gives the precise answer to your question. Now, it's much more difficult for me to answer the question about why the Obama administration has continued this policy. They didn't have the personal relationship. If anything, our dependence on Saudi Arabia and the rest of the world has declined during the Obama administration. And while we still look to Saudi Arabia for intelligence assistance, frankly, the Saudi intelligence agencies are no Israel in terms of their competence. So I don't know why the Obama administration, unless you read Keys to the Kingdom and find it.
Dan,
Does anybody in the audience who's got something to say?
Yeah, Porter Goss was former CIA agent and short-time director of the CIA. Have you had any interesting conversations with him about it?
Well, I talked, as I said, he was the first person I called when the statement was made to see if he had a different recollection than I did as to whether we'd been informed about the Sarasota situation, and his answer was the same as mine, no.
Thank you, Chief. Senator, after 9/11, everyone was screaming about intelligence. CIA didn't do FBI, Defense Intelligence didn't do this. I have never heard a appraisal of the National Security Agency. I mean, they monitor all communications traffic around the world. And if the NSA didn't know that people in Saudi Arabia, people in Afghanistan, people in San Diego were firing off messages that were, suspicious, where was the NSA on?
Well, I'd say their record was spotty.
Thank you, sir.
They had an interception station at a site in the Middle East which monitored Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden's traffic. And they had over a period of years, picked up some valuable information which we had used to abort efforts. But on the big issue, it just didn't get done. Whether that was because bin Laden was able to use particularly effective methods of communicating with his 19 people. It may have even had something to do with this question of, was there a support network which allowed him to communicate with them without going through normal channels or exposing his people while they were in the U.S. I don't know the answer to that question, but I don't think the NSA is without some responsibility, as are the other major intelligence agencies.
Thank you, sir. One more question.
I actually read the 2004 book, and in it, again and again, you encounter the FBI acting in a political way to frustrate what you're doing. The FBI is serving the then current administration. Is that what things have come to? I mean, do we need to have a Hoover in there who at least has his own agenda? Or is the FBI business as usual now the servant of the administration?
Again, the ultimate answer to that is found in Keys to the Kingdom. But my own, frankly, there were too many agencies and individuals who were working in a common way to cover up the Saudi involvement for this to have been one agency, one rogue agency doing it. I believe that there were some directions from the White House as to how Saudi Arabia was to be treated during this process. Of course, one of the best examples of how we bent over backwards to facilitate Saudi Arabia was the famous incident of the airlift of Saudis out of the United States. A couple of days after 9/11, the Saudi ambassador to the United States, Prince Bandar, who is a character in Keys to the Kingdom, went to the White House, and he had a previous personal relationship with the president, explained that a lot of his people were anxious for their safety in the United States because Americans knew that 15 of the 19 hijackers had been Saudis. They were concerned that they may take retribution against them. And Bandar asked Bush if he could get permission to charter a plane and fly what turned out to be 142 Saudis back to Saudi Arabia, even though at that point all other commercial aviation in the United States was grounded. Bush gave him that permission, and Bandar did an assessment of where Saudis were in order to pick out the location that would be most convenient to the largest number. And where do you think that was in the week after 9/11? No, it wasn't Florida. Huh? No. No. Texas? No. Well, the answer... No, you're not going to have to read the book to get this piece of it. The answer is Lexington, Kentucky. Now, you might say, that's an odd place. Well, what was going on in Lexington, Kentucky early in September of 2001? What goes on in Lexington, Kentucky every early September? And that is the horse sales. And there were more Saudis in Lexington than there were in New York or Washington or Los Angeles or any other place there for the horse sales. So that was the logical place to send the 747. There was one plane that flew from Tampa to Lexington with 3 Saudis, at least one of whom had a nexus to this situation in Sarasota, who then got on the plane and flew back to Saudi Arabia. The FBI initially was said to have given an okay on this, that there were no people of interest on the plane. Subsequently, the FBI said we hadn't been consulted, and looking at the manifest of who was on the plane, there were several people, including relatives of Osama bin Laden, that we would have liked to have interviewed.
Does this mean that you think that the Saudi royal family was mixed up in this?
Well, Saudi Arabia is such a tightly controlled society, it's hard to believe that something as significant as giving significant support, aid, and comfort to a terrorist group inside the United States whose purpose, intent, and ultimate action was to kill thousands of Americans, that all that happened without the royal family being aware of and at least acquiescing in all of those activities. There has been a sad decline in the capacity of American journalism, particularly to do good investigations. They're expensive. They frequently end up being a dry hole. There's no story to print, and therefore they tend to be one of the first casualties when the newsroom has to be swept. Broward Bulldog is an example of a new initiative to try to provide to the people of Broward County, and in this case, the people of America, information that would not otherwise be available to them. So I thank you for the fact that you're here tonight and what that says about your understanding of and support for the mission of Broward Bulldog.
And we thank you.
I thought it went great. I thought Bob was, spot on in his comments for everything. We had, it looks like probably about 125, 130 people, maybe a shade more than that. So I think we did very well. And we're looking forward to doing another one of these.